Bom dia, bem-vindos de volta ao curso Brasil e Palestina, Fontes de Identificação. E welcome everyone. For those who don't speak Portuguese, this course is in English exactly for that reason. Thank you also for waiting half an hour today to begin. It was necessary to adjust everyone's agenda. I welcome both our lecturers, our guest today, Adriana Testa. She holds a PhD in social anthropology from the University of São Paulo, and she's a researcher at the Centro de Estudos Ameríndios at the University of São Paulo, the Amerindian Center for Studies. She works with the Guarani in Brazil. She has done wide and deep research with the Guarani Mbya communities close to in São Paulo, actually, focusing on territorial rights, migrations, kinship, political leadership, shamanism, and the circulation of knowledge. And she is the responsible for the text that is in our sources for this class in the Moodle. There's one text that was written by this Guarani community, and Adriana facilitated and participated in making this test. So it's their voice in writing that you will find in our sources for today. And I'd like to welcome very much also Ahmed Amara. He's a senior researcher at the Human Rights Clinic at Al-Quds University. I got to know Ahmed, first of all, through his writings, through his texts, and from wonderful research on the Bedouin, Palestinian Bedouin. So welcome both of you. Thank you very much for accepting this invitation. And I'll leave you first of all with Adriana's class.
Good morning, good afternoon. I want to thank Arlene, Rafael, Vitória, Ahmad, and also the people from Editora Tabla and those watching us. I'm truly honored and excited to be a part of this initiative and this dialogue between Palestinian and Brazilian researchers and activists. I'm using my cell phone, which is kind of precarious, so I'm going to try to hold it in my hand as we talk. I want to share with you some slides. If we can begin the slideshow, please. Okay. I thought we could begin discussing some basic and general information about the indigenous peoples in Brazil. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. In Brazil, we have roughly 266 different ethnic groups who speak approximately 160 different languages. These are very conservative numbers. If you check on the internet, you might find larger numbers referring to different ethnic groups and languages. I usually use a source that is really trustworthy, and they present these numbers. The estimated population of indigenous people in Brazil is of 896,917 people. It's interesting to note that 36% of this population actually lives in cities. For example, in São Paulo, we have the Guarani who live in 2 indigenous lands, and we also have other indigenous people who don't have lands in the city of São Paulo. And that happens in most capitals in Brazil, medium cities, small cities, and so forth. We can go to the next slide, please. When we think of indigenous peoples in Brazil, usually we think of the Amazon region. But actually, if we take a look at this map, we find that the Amazon region, which is in green and comprises states in the north and Midwest areas of Brazil, actually does not account for the major part of indigenous population in Brazil. What we have is actually that 52% of the indigenous in Brazil live outside of this region, in other areas of the Midwest, the Northeast, the Southeast, and Southeastern regions of Brazil. So when our imagination automatically goes to the Amazon when we think of the indigenous people, that isn't actually accurate. Next, please. Well, in Brazil, we have 732 indigenous lands which are recognized by the Brazilian state. That means that the Brazilian state acknowledges that they exist and that the indigenous live on these lands. But of these more than 700 lands, only 496 of them have completed the process of demarcation. The process of demarcation is the process by which the Brazilian state secures these lands so that the indigenous can live on them exclusively. These lands don't become patrimony of the indigenous. They aren't private lands. They continue to be lands of the Union, but they can be used only by the indigenous people. So they should be free of invasions. They should be free of exploitation of minerals, wood, and so forth. What I've put here is a figure that shows the main steps taken to demarcate these lands. So it begins with the process of identification, which is a study done with the indigenous community, anthropologists, historians, environmental specialists. And after this study is completed, the report needs to be approved by FUNAI, which is the federal agency responsible for indigenous affairs in the Brazilian state. When this report is approved and published, we open a new period of contestations, which means that any individual, group, and even state and municipal governments can protest against the demarcation of this land. But if all goes well, the land is finally declared by the Ministry of Justice. And then the president of Brazil needs to homologate this land. This process that has many intermediary steps between each one of these other phases is a very lengthy process that can take decades to be completed. And as you see, only some of the lands that are officially recognized by and acknowledged by the state have completed this process. However, there are another 530 lands which are occupied and demanded by the indigenous or aren't occupied by them because of violent conflict, so they can't even access their lands. And these are lands which the state doesn't even acknowledge. These are lands that don't have any sort of measure taken to secure them. So what we see is that in Brazil today, of over 1,200 areas that have been demanded by the indigenous, only 39% of them have been guaranteed by the Brazilian state. Next, please. Okay. What we have in Brazil in terms of land and land expropriation is a lot of violence. Most of the violence targeted at indigenous people and indigenous persons is related to conflicts concerning the land. We also have problems with medical assistance, education, racial discrimination, and other themes. I brought some basic data about violence against indigenous peoples. What we have are numbers for the year of 2021. And what we see is that in 2021, 176 people indigenous persons were murdered. 22% of these were under 20 years of age. If we compare the year of 2021, when Bolsonaro was president, with the years of 2003 and 2015, when Lula and Dilma were president, what we see is that in these earlier years, we had an annual average of 69 indigenous persons being assassinated, which is still very elevated. However, we see that during the Bolsonaro government, these numbers escalated more than ever before. Another way that we can measure and understand violence against indigenous peoples, especially due to land conflicts and the lack of medical assistance, is when we look at the rates of childhood mortality. And what we see is that in 2021, 744 children less than 5 years of age died due to these problems. We can also look at the rates of suicide among indigenous persons to understand how these land conflicts and other acts of violence have impacted their lives. And what we see is that in 2021, 148 indigenous persons committed suicide in Brazil, and 39% of them were less than 20 years of age. Next, please. Thank you. Well, now I'd like to focus more on the Guarani who live in Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Bolivia. Here we have a map that shows the indigenous areas in which these Guarani live. The numbers indicate how many communities are present in each area. What we have is an estimated population of 285,000 Guarani people in this area of South America, who live in 1,400 different communities. 30% of the Guarani live in Brazil, and the Guarani population in Brazil is usually divided into three different subgroups: the Nyandeva, the Mbya, and the Kaiowá. The Kaiowá and the Nyandeva, who actually call themselves just Guarani, they live mostly in Mato Grosso do Sul, and they comprise a population of 64,500. So the major part of the Guarani population in Brazil is actually in this area. In the south and southeastern regions of Brazil, we have approximately 20,000 Guarani people living, and they live in 153 different areas. However, over 130 of these lands have not been demarcated by the Brazilian government. So they live in very insecure and precarious situations in these lands. And they have been demanding the regularization of these lands for decades. Next, please. When we look at the land expropriation that the Guarani have suffered in Brazil, we find violence, conflicts, and also their strategies of resistance. Until the beginning of the 20th century, we could say that the Guarani lived in villages that spread across Paraguay, Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil, and they circulated with relative freedom throughout this territory. However, from 1910 on, the Brazilian state, with their official indigenous agencies, began to intensify the expropriation of the Guarani lands and to promote their occupation and exploitation for farming and the extraction of wood and erva mate. Erva mate is actually leaves that are cut from very tall trees and used in teas. It's also used by the Guarani not only for teas, but in their rituals. And they're actually the ones that taught us to drink erva mate. But their territory was taken from them so that they could, colonizers, Brazilian colonizers, could exploit all of these areas for economic purposes. And the Guarani, as well as the Caingangue and other indigenous peoples in these areas, they were actually forced to participate in these economic activities as slaves. Being confined within minute and very overcrowded reservations, the Guarani were subjected to forced labor, and they were also exposed to diseases, famine, incarceration within the reservation prisons, and also torture. Those who wanted or needed to leave the reservation for any reason had to get a written permission from the reservation employee. And those who were found walking about without this document were quickly returned to the reservation, locked up in the reservation prison, and tortured. Despite this, we know that the Guarani organized escapes. As individuals and groups, they would flee these reservations and reoccupy areas of their territory where the state authorities were less present, especially areas that were hidden in the Atlantic forest, which it spreads along the Brazilian coast. Next slide, please. Oh, I forgot to say that in the picture, in the last slide, we have, can we go back? Thank you. We have an image of a Guarani family that has been incarcerated in a prison that was actually built by the dictatorship specifically for indigenous people. Next, please. Okay. During the dictatorship, which lasted from 1964 to 1985 in Brazil, the Guarani along the Brazilian coast, who up until then had been relatively free from persecution, were also targeted and returned to reservations. some of them were also taken to concentration camps that were built specifically for the indigenous persons, as we saw in the picture before. In a recent article, Cicarone describes the experiences of the Guarani and Tupiniquim families who were removed from their lands in Espírito Santo and imprisoned for 6 years in the Fazenda Guarani Penal Colony, which was actually a former torture facility for political prisoners. This group was of about 60, 70 people, and they were mixed with indigenous persons from all over Brazil. During this time in which they were imprisoned, their land was handed over by the Brazilian government to a eucalyptus company called Aracruz Florestal, which has since then changed its name but continues operating in Brazil. And this company not only occupied and exploited the land, but also caused extreme environmental devastation. And the impacts of this environmental devastation continued to this day, as does the struggle of the Guarani and Tupiniquim that have returned to the area and are fighting to reclaim this territory. The expropriation of their lands was also aided by intense media campaigns in which the military government labeled the Guarani as foreigners because their territory expands not only from Brazil, but also to Paraguay, Argentina, and Uruguay. The military government would say that they are not Brazilians, that they are foreigners, and this discourse was used to convince public opinion and deny the Guarani fundamental rights to the land and other rights, such as health care and education. Next, please. Okay. One of the strategies of resistance that the Guarani developed during this period was fleeing from the reservations. And following the information given by the Guarani about these experiences, I mapped out a comparison between the most frequent birthplaces in different time periods. So I used a network of 1,775 people who I had information of where they were born. And I divided this network into two parts: people who were born before 1985, so roughly from the end of the 19th century to 1985, and people who were born after 1985. What we see is that the network is divided basically almost in half. 835 people were born in 42 places before 1985, and 940 people were born in 30 places after this period. This network is not a complete census of all the Guarani who were born in Brazil during this period. This is actually a sample of information that I was able to gather through interviews with the Guarani. And what we see to the left is the first period in 1985, where you can actually see that the two major circles are reservations that were created to confine the Guarani. And so you have the major part of the population being born in these reservations, whereas lands that they fled to, such as Tenondeporã in São Paulo, Aracruz in Espírito Santo, which we already mentioned, and Jaraguá also in São Paulo, had a smaller population during this period. However, when we look at people being born after 1985, we see an explosion of people in Tenondeporã in São Paulo, Jaraguá in São Paulo, and those two reservations where the Guarani were confined to before they decrease in number of births. However, people continue living in these places, being born, and so forth. I'd also like to mention that of this network of 1,775 people, 1,500 of them are actually part of a very extensive family. So they're all related by kinship ties, which shows us how this family migrated within different parts of the territory in order to flee persecution. Next, please. What we find is that despite all of the oppression, land expropriation, and violence that the Guarani have suffered during this time, they have also made their culture thrive. They've kept their culture very much alive, which includes their religion, their language, and also the way in which they circulate through this extensive territory that has been cut by highways, national frontiers, and touristic resorts, companies, and so forth. And when we say that the Guarani move from one place to another in this territory, they aren't wandering about aimlessly. What they do is that actually the gods reveal to them where and when they should go. And by circulating throughout their territory, they seek to protect these different areas and also strengthen the ties between the families that are dispersed scattered along different points of the territory and that are facing different struggles. So they have a very extensive network of places and relatives who are all woven together through the circulation of continuous circulation of people from one point to another. In this image, I've mapped out the movement of people from different indigenous lands to Jaraguá, which isn't just people who were visiting, which is extremely frequent. The Guarani visit each other from one indigenous land to another in order to participate in rituals and also in order to help each other in the different struggles that they face. This diagram actually shows us in the center, you have the Jaraguá indigenous land, which is in the city of São Paulo. It is known to be the smallest indigenous land in the world. And the Guarani are still struggling because the land has been, we did a report in order to demarcate this land, and it was approved by the Ministry of Justice. But it has since then been suspended. So the land hasn't been secured for them yet. And they receive death threats. They have conflicts concerning this land. So it's actually a very violent situation in which they are living today. But what we can see is a sample of 9 different indigenous lands where people have moved from and come to Jaraguá indigenous land. I also want to mention that this is just a sample of 9 lands. What I mapped out was actually 23 different lands, which are sources of migration to Jaraguá. And in the complete research, what I actually have are 66 different indigenous lands from which people have migrated to and fro. Next, please. Okay. Since spatial mobility is such an important theme concerning the Guarani, especially the Guarani Mbya in South and Southeastern Brazil, we wanted to develop methods in which we could measure the spatial mobility and show how important it has been in Guarani culture. And so what we have found is that out of 373 adults, 79% of them have moved to a different indigenous land at least once in their lifetime. And out of 459 children, 69 of them were born in a different indigenous land compared to their parents. Also, if we look at marriage among people, we'll find that in reference to 135 couples, 72% of them were married to people who were actually born in a different indigenous land. So what we see are different measures and points that show us how important spatial mobility really is to the Guarani and how important all of the areas of their territory are to their culture and their political organization, to their cosmology. Next, please. Another way that we can look at the territory and the people living in this territory is by finding kinship relations that actually tie all of the families that are scattered along this territory in Paraguay, Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil. And what we find is that what I was able to find is that there are 59 areas where the Guarani have kinship ties among themselves. And this is shown in this diagram, in which we have the areas according to different colors and kinship ties that actually unite all of the people who live in this territory. What I'd also like to point out is that it is actually through the kinship ties that many things circulate among the Guarani in these areas. For example, knowledge, support, economic support, actually political support, and so forth. I'm actually going to finish, and next, please. And just point out that during this period, several political or Guarani organizations have been created to defend the Guarani rights, especially to education, but also culture, medical assistance, and education. And I'd like to point out 3 of the main Guarani organizations that you can find more information about on their websites and Instagram accounts and so forth. You can learn more about them and you can support their causes. The first is Atuguaçu, that is Grande Assembleia do Povo Guarani, which can be translated as the Great Assembly of the Guarani People. It was created in the 1970s in the state of Mato Grosso do Sul, and it is recognized as the oldest indigenous political organization still present in existent today. In addition to this organization, we also have the Cunhangue Atuguaçu, which is an organization of the Guarani women. It's Grande Assembleia das Mulheres Kaiowá em Guarani, which we can translate as the Great Assembly of Guarani and Kaiowá women, and it was created in 2006 in Mato Grosso do Sul. In addition to this, we have the Comissão Guarani Urupá, which was created in 2006, and they work in South and Southeastern Brazil. I think that's all I have to present for now. I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm open to any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Adriana. And now we are watch the explanation to Professor Ahmed, and after we talk about the both presentations. So, Professor, now is your turn.
Hello. Thank you, Vittoria. Thank you, Adriana, for the very interesting talk. Yes, that's my presentation. Hello, everyone. I'll be talking what I called here the Palestinian Bedouin land question. It is also related, let's say, to the question of indigenous people, to settler colonial policies. But this time we'll be talking about Palestine and the Israeli policies. But my goal in the talk is more to discuss 2 main things. One is the transformation of the Palestinian Bedouin communities in Palestine, in Israel, and in the West Bank in the last, let's say, century, and taking this within the context of Palestine more broadly. So it's important to stress that whatever I discuss more about the Bedouin, it is because they are Palestinians more than because of their Bedouin identity. So like Palestine in general, it's a very accumulative, let's say, geography or space. You had many civilizations, you had many people who lived throughout the centuries in Palestine. We had different rulers. And the same thing about the Palestinian identity. The Palestinian national identity is also very inclusive and cumulative in a way. So you have different cultural minorities, you have different religious minorities who are all belonging into the Palestinian national identity. So when we talk about the Bedouin, it should be stressed, it's like let's say in a way, each group has its own particularities within, in terms of the culture, in terms of the economic habits, lifestyle, history, their own space, but still these identities are not mutually exclusive. The other thing also that I wanted to stress is the question of indigeneity. So like nowadays, we talk about all Palestinians being the native to Palestine and being subjected to first Zionist and British colonial policies and practices, the accumulation of it, the peak of it in 1948 with the establishment of Israel. But Israel is still carry out heavily the Zionist ideology, which is a settler colonial ideology in Palestine. Now seeking exactly to control space, control the land, and also in a way forming a special space that allows the state of Israel to control land use, and to control land allocation in a way that Jewidizes the Palestinian space through different mechanisms. Today, we will discuss the case of the Bedouin communities. So if we move to the next slide, please, Victoria. So Bedouins, we can say the Bedouin Arabs, tribal groups who have inhabited the Middle East in general and the Arabia, let's say, the region for many centuries. And they lived since at least the 7th century in southern Palestine. And southern Palestine today is mostly known as the Negev or the Naqab, but these are not the indigenous names of the region. It was known more as the Gaza region or the Beersheba region, Bir Sabah. So, but here I use mostly southern Palestine or Naqab, just as these terms are more common today. By the end of the Ottoman rule, by 1918, these Bedouin communities in southern Palestine were estimated at 50,000. And by 1948, until the Nakba, they reached a number of 90,000. Now, 1948, like the rest of Palestine or the rest of the Palestinian communities, it was a very, let's say, formative years in terms of local, social, and spatial meanings for the Bedouin that experienced a heavy social collapse. And in the next slide, please. Now, in terms of the geography, it's very important to highlight. I don't know if here you can see, but what you see in the picture is mainly southern Palestine, to the right, the Dead Sea, and to the left is the Mediterranean. And most of the region below is southern Palestine together with the Sinai Peninsula. And this is the natural, let's say, space for the Palestinian Bedouin tribes until 1918, until the end of the Ottoman rule. So this natural space very much changed also with the beginning of the mandate, the British mandate after 1948, and very much so after 1948. In the next slide, we will see these changes. Now, what we see here is, let's say, southern Palestine. We still can see what's named here the Negev. It's like the light shadowed, the Gaza Strip to the left, and the West Bank and the rest of the state of Israel, where in 1948, out of the 90,000 Palestinian Bedouins who lived in southern Palestine, 85% ended up as refugees. They were expelled from their natural space, ended up refugees in the Gaza Strip, in the West Bank, in Egypt, and in Jordan. Now, the 13,000 who remained within Israel and became Israeli citizens, the Israeli authorities and the Israeli army displaced these communities into the dark shadowed area called the Sayak, The Sayaj, it's the exception region or the fenced region, which constitutes nearly 8% of the Naqab of southern Palestine, and all of the Bedouin communities were concentrated by the Israeli authorities within this area, very much like the reserves that are imposed on indigenous communities throughout the world. Briefly, today we're talking only within Israel. I'll come to the West Bank also and discuss the West Bank. We're talking about nearly 280,000 Bedouin Palestinians in southern Palestine who were subjected by the Israeli authorities to, on the one hand, first urbanization. So we have half of this population living in what the Israeli government initiated and established as a state-planned towns. They're known as the townships. We will see them now. Whereas the other half remained in their historical villages or in the villages that they were displaced to after 1948. The first wave, there's the major expulsion in 1948. There is minor expulsion cases outside of the borders of Israel that continued until 1956, but the internal displacement happened also in the early 50s by the Israeli forces into this dark shaded area. Now, all of these villages and townships, they're within this area today. So the new villages within this area and the historical villages, we have about 45 in number that are deemed illegal by the state of Israel. I'll also explain what do we mean by illegal or unrecognized villages. In the West Bank, the number is estimated of 45,000 Bedouins, but we have 6,000 who are refugees from southern Palestine, who ended up from the area between Hebron, today's southern Hebron Hills, and the north of Beersheba. We have communities that were expelled from that area, and today they became about 6,000 Bedouin refugees, mostly living in the central West Bank. The next slide, please. Now, when we talk about the unrecognized villages in the West Bank or in Israel, what do we mean by that? Simply put, these are villages that existed historically, at least for decades, some of which are before the establishment of the State of Israel. But under the Israeli law, military or civil, because of the West Bank or inside Israel, they're deemed illegal. They are illegal constructions. They are informal instructions, like favelas or anything that is subject to demolition per the Israeli law. Now, at the top, for example, this is Bedouin village. It's Khan al-Ahmar in the West Bank. At the bottom, these are unrecognized Bedouin villages in the Naqab, inside Israel. But the geography and the Israeli policies very much resemble each other. That's why it's very important when we look at the Israeli policies from the top, whether inside Israel or in the West Bank, they're unified. They're like settler colonial that are conducted through different means, through different laws, through different policies, through different mechanisms. But overall, they serve the same ideology and they reproduce the same geography, for example, here of illegal zones or illegality of the Bedouin that are subject to demolition and removal. In the next slide, we'll see how a township, these are the first urbanization project, which began in the late 60s by the Israeli government, which hoped at the time to establish or initiate in its own project 3 townships for all the Bedouins. And this is how it looks like, mini overcrowded urban centers for the Bedouin. Today, they're rated the poorest by Israeli calculations and grading. They're rated the poorest in Israel with the lowest socioeconomic conditions of unemployment, crimes, state services, and so on. In the late 60s and early 70s, Israel initiated 3 townships, but it ended up until today founding, quote unquote, 7 different townships for the Bedouin. However, this forced urbanization project managed to urbanize half of the Bedouin communities. The other half remain in their original villages or outside the townships, and there are different reasons of who decided to move. I mean, it should be in a question mark. It's not really who decided to move. There is a lot of lack of what's called informed or prior consent to any of these projects. But people found themselves under military rule from 1948 to 1966 in Israel. Maybe I haven't mentioned this, but Palestinian Bedouins, like the rest of Palestinian citizens within Israel, they were subject to a military rule until 1966. It ended only about 10 months before the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, when Israel basically transferred and copied the military rule from inside Israel to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So then it was like the internal displacement, and right after what's called the first urbanization project, it went through different waves, but people were forced in one way or another to accept their forced displacement, but others rejected and remained in their original villages. Now, what is happening exactly with the Palestinian Bedouin land question? Let's see the next slide, please. As I said, whenever I say it should be put within this context. And I outlined here Ottoman rule, the British rule. From 1517 to 1917, we had the Ottoman rule, and then 1917 to 1948, it's a British rule, but the official mandate is from 1922 to 1948. And this is important because today's Israeli legal system still contains and includes Ottoman law, British law, and Israeli law. And explain the relevance of this, but it's important that when the British occupied Palestine and the mandate, they kept the Ottoman legal system until it's changed or amended. In 1948, when Israel was founded, it did the same. It kept the applicable legal system, which included Ottoman and British laws, until amended or changed or voided or replaced. So we ended up until today having Ottoman law, British law, and Israeli law in Palestine. Just the previous slide, please, Victoria. The one before. Until we get to the one and the one before it, because it explains that during the Ottoman, yes, here. Okay. Just to stress, for 7 decades, when the first Zionist immigrants in the 1870s and until 1948 immigrated to Palestine and initiated the land purchase, including some minor allocations by the British mandate, all of these institutions managed to purchase and control 6% of Palestine until 1948. Now, Israel ended up founded over 78% of the area of Palestine. Today, there are 95% of the land within Israel became state and public land. So it jumped from nearly 10% in 1948 to today, 95%. And the process was very clear, basically transferring lands from Palestinian hands to Israeli state hands. And here, whenever we say state, Israeli hands, it means in the vast majority, for the use of Jewish communities to Jewidize Palestine. And all of this was done within the law. Okay, if we move to the next slide. The process in brief, we can't explain it all here, but first it was for land confiscation and land disposition from Palestinian. Okay, and then transferring of this land from, again, Palestinian to state/Jewish. And the next step was to control these lands and to control the redistribution and reallocation of these lands, that they cannot get back to Palestinian or other lands. The next goal was to control the land use through zoning and planning laws and regulations. And this was done in addition to the apparatus of the government and the different ministries. There were like special governmental and semi-governmental organizations that, let's say, regulated the land system in Palestine or in Israel, which is the Israel Land Authority, the Jewish National Fund, the Jewish Agency, the World Zionist Organization, and there is a special authority that's called the Bedouin Authority. All of these organizations, I can't delve into very much here, but the goal is really to move these lands from Palestinian hands to state and Jewish hands, and to maintain them and ensure their use by the state and Jewish organization for, again, Jewish goals, Jewish objectives, Zionist objectives of Jewidizing the space. In the next slide, we'll discuss now, let's say, two elements in the Bedouin case, which apply, let's say, to the entire area of Palestine, which is, again, the land on the one hand. The second is the zoning and planning, the land control. So if you discuss Jerusalem, for example, today, you can talk very much about land confiscation and then zoning and planning to control the Palestinian space or interrupt the growth and expansion of Palestinian space while enabling Jewish settlement or Jewish expansion in different ways. If you talk about the West Bank in general, it's the same. The Galilee, it's the same. So it's very important to analyze in a way the heavily legalistic approach by the Israeli government and what's called the neutral zoning and planning that seems from point look that it's neutral. Now, the land question, first, after 1948, Israel confiscated the vast majority of the lands in the Naqab, okay, and registered them as state lands. Very few that remained, from an Israeli perspective, subject to dispute. Israel initiated or resumed what was started by the British originally, the land title settlement process. Very easy. It was conducted in different areas in the world, called the torrent system. Whoever claims right to a specific land can come and claim this land and register it under his name. It will be parceled into blocks and parcels with specific numbers and specific cadastral mapping. It's very much associated, again, modern nation states, very much with the settler colonial states, where we know most of the massive confiscation were done by the pen and the papers, by maps and by laws. Now, here, to jump to the Bedouin case and get to our subject. The land settlement process was initiated by the government. They asked the Bedouin communities, whoever claims rights on lands, please come and file a land claim. We've got 3,220 land claims by Palestinian Bedouin citizens of Israel that covered an area of 1.5 million dunams, which is 7%, constitutes 7% of the historical space of the original space of the Palestinian tribes. In the next slide, please. What happened is that after receiving these claims, the state of Israel decided to freeze in a way, these claims. They didn't proceed with the land claims. Instead, they went and preferred to negotiate with the Bedouin, and they founded a special committee to look into these claims, to say, do the Bedouin have land rights or they don't have land rights? Now, it's very interesting here that there was a special commission established by Israel in 1975 to look into the land claims. And their conclusion was, one is that the 1.5 million dunams, we should drop half a million dunams from them, which were lands for grazing and pasture. From a state perspective, these grazing lands are state lands, so they took them out of the equation. The remaining merely 1 million dunam. The conclusion, legally speaking, was that these lands are state lands. The legal argument, which I will explain here, was based purely on the Ottoman Land Code from 1858, okay, that continued to apply. There is a land category under the Ottoman Land Code that's called Mawat land, dead land, okay? Now, what is the legal argument? And bear with me, please, 2 minutes here on this legal argument, because we deal with this in Israeli courts. You handle this with the Israeli institutions, Israeli State Attorney Office. The Bedouin communities have to deal with all of this complexity that is intentionally very much created by usually the colonial powers, right? They create a lot of technicalities, a lot of legalistic arguments, a lot of complexities, bureaucracies that people are entrapped within it, and it depoliticizes very much the colonial ideology behind it. Here, the committee said there is an Ottoman land category in Article 6 of the Ottoman Land Code that says land which is not in the possession of anyone and was not dedicated for the public, and it is land that lies at a distance from the outskirts of a town or a village or an inhabited area, where the loud scream of someone reaches, or it's 30 minutes walk from these outskirts, and it's estimated at 1.5 miles. So look at this. The definition itself is very interesting. But simply put, if someone stands at the outskirts or the limits of the inhabited area and screams beyond the reach of this voice, it should be considered dead land. Dead land means, in the Ottoman law, that it's available for the public. Anyone who goes and cultivates this land should receive this land for himself. In the next slide, maybe it will help us with the explanation. This is Article 103 of the Ottoman Land Code that says anyone who revives this dead land, he gets this land. But note, at the beginning, it's land that should be not in the possession of anyone. It's not land that possessed or used or cultivated by anyone. It's dead land. It's public land. It's the total opposite of state land. The Ottoman land law does not include a category that it's called state land. It's by the British and the Israelis. There is no such a thing as a state land. It's absolutely the opposite. It's called public land, open for everyone. Anyone can come and revive this land, because when you cultivate it, it means the state treasury will get more taxes. It's called the tithe. 10% of the revenues goes to the treasury. So the goal was to encourage people to hold more lands and cultivate more land and turn them more productive, from dead to the life. In the next slide, this is another minor legal amendments before I go to the explanation. In 1921, the British made this ordinance. It's like only the 4 lines. It said, from now on, from 1921, from now on, anyone who wants to revive the dead land should get a consent from the government. Otherwise, he will be deemed a trespasser. But then they give this transitional period, transitional time window for people who claim rights to have 2 months to come and register their rights. Okay, I'm done with the legal arguments here. It's Ottoman and British. Next. Okay. It was the commission and the Israeli government came and said, yeah, we will go by the distance of 1.5 miles. We will measure the distance only from a village or a town, not from inhabited area. And then they came and said, Bedouin village or encampment, it's not deemed a village or a town or inhabited area as the law requires. They came up with this argument. Even if there is like a town or a village, such town or village should have existed in 1858. I mean, in 1858, there were only 300,000 people living in Palestine. Adding to this, they said in 1921, when the British enacted the amendment to the Mawat law, the Bedouin had their last chance with the 2 months in 1921. They didn't do so, and they have, I'm quoting, only to blame themselves for not doing so. Adding to this, there's like the discourse that, and this is very important because this applies to many tribal and indigenous communities, and it always we should be aware of the diversity and the heterogeneity and the pluralities among these communities. They said, oh, Bedouin, there are nomads. As Adriana said before, they were wandering aimlessly. They're roaming aimlessly in a space. They're not connected to the space. Their loyalty is to the tribe. It's not to the space. And this is very much to denationalize both, like the Palestinian identity, the connection to the land, that at the same time to legitimize the confiscation of the land. So in this way, you're not displacing the Bedouin. You're not removing them from their lands. And as a state, you're not confiscating the land because it's not theirs. So it's a perfect win-win situation for Israel. More so, the Bedouin became trespassers on state land. So even if you have existed from the 7th century or from the 18th century or 2-3 centuries before the establishment of Israel on your land, within this like artistic, legalistic argument, you automatically became a criminal on your own land, on your like ancestral lands. Okay. The next slide, please. Okay. The other aspect of it, which they're both interrelated, and this is exactly the same situation that applies also to Bedouin villages in the West Bank. But instead of the Israeli civil law, there are Israeli military orders. In 1965, and we're talking about the zoning question, 1965, Israel enacted the planning and construction law. It regulated the question of zoning, land use, the designation of land, for what purposes it could be used, and the requirement to issue a building permit for each house. If you come to build a house, this is everywhere now, you need to apply to get a permit to build this house. Obviously, if you want to build a house, the land should be zoned as residential. Cannot be zoned as a natural reserve or as a fire zone, right? Or industrial zone. Industrial for industry, residential for residence. Now, what happened in 1965 and right before that, when Israel prepared all the mapping for the state, for like a logical reason, it ignored all the Bedouin localities. The Bedouin villages did not appear on the official state zoning plans after 1965. So on the one hand, they became invisible on these maps. So all of these villages are zoned today, then and today, as industrial zones. or as fire zones and military zones for the army, or as natural reserves and national parks. They're zoned anything but residential areas and residential zones. So on the one hand, they're invisible. On the other, they automatically became illegal because there is a village on, let's say, industrial zones or military zone, and there are no building permits. So all of these houses turned illegal, and any houses built afterwards, they became illegal. We know that the Bedouin grew 10 times, 15 times more since 1948 without trying to answer this natural growth within lands and zoning. So what happened is that we have about 45 villages with nearly 130,000 Palestinian Bedouin Israeli citizens in these villages. All of these villages, they lack the basic services of paved roads, running water, electricity. They're not connected to the electricity. And above all, they're subject to demolition and forced displacement. In the second one, please. Now, occasionally, the state authorities, they conduct demolitions. They cannot conduct demolitions for the 45 villages, but we're talking about an average. I mean, the last year, there were nearly demolitions of 2,000 homes or structures in the Negev, in the Naqab, in these villages. It's much more even than the demolitions in the West Bank, which if when they're happening, they could look in such situation like invasion. This is the demolition in Al-Araqib village in the Naqab. Next one, please, Victoria. This how they look. I mean, not all the demolitions are like that. Here you can see the tear gas, the bullets. You see one of the Bedouin leaders here of Al-Araqib village that was imprisoned. Actually, he ran few months in prison because of living and trespassing and interrupting the demolitions of the police, the Israeli police. Next one, please. Other ways from the Israeli side of enforcing. Now, all of these activities of home demolitions for the built-up area, in this case here, we see the lands that are being cultivated by the Bedouin. And this is a very important point that I'll stress towards the end. I think I still have 10 minutes. It's good. I'll stress in the last part. But here, in some cases, when these lands that the state deem as its own and the Bedouin are trespassers on them, when they cultivate them, you can see bulldozers coming and uprooting the trees. You can see, like in the middle, herbicides to kill the crops. You can see tractors that plowing the cultivation and the crops, all the fields, destroying them, all under the law enforcement. And on the other hand, you will see God TV Forest, for example, the Jewish National Fund and other organizations planting trees on these lands. So you have cases where Bedouin villages are being destroyed and lands, and instead initiating forestation. This is actually a repeat of what was happening in 1948, when after 1948, Israel deserted and expelled Palestinians from 500 Palestinian villages. In the 50s, all were exploded and destroyed, except for a few examples. And then they were all had the Jewish National Fund to do forestation over these villages, that just in a massive erasure campaign. Here it's the same, but the logic, which is very interesting to look at, is that designating the land as dead, where it's very green and it's with a lot of tree and nature and life, but it is the law enforcement authorities that come and kills this space because it's Palestinian Bedouin, and instead replacing this with Jewish National Fund forestation. So you'll see the cycle of erasure and replacement very clear in this case. Next, please. Of course, as I mentioned, it's a native anti-colonial struggle that, like Brazil, like New Zealand, like Canada, like the US, like in many other places, which is very important to stress in this case. And here I want to say something about indigeneity, please, in the next slide. Okay. First, just to note that most of the studies about the Native Bedouin, and I believe, and I say the Native Bedouin paradigm here, it's very hegemonic in the studies, and this is resembles very much the studies of Native communities and indigenous communities. That says, you know, they're tribal, they're primitive, they live aimlessly. In the best case scenario, there are some pastoralists. And here very much applies the same. And this scholarship, this scholarly narrative, the hegemonic, depicts the Negev as a desert occupied by nomads, by people who are like live in autonomy and primitive, awaiting for, you know, the state to come and integrate there and do this development process from like this modernization for these tribes to be integrated into the state apparatus. And this is very much apparent in the case of the Bedouin, the savagery, right? They're savage, that living. However, next, please. Just a note on the indigeneity for here, I don't know if you can read it, but in 1919 already, with the establishment of the mandate, the local Palestinian Jaffa Muslim Christian committee sent a telegram to the British government saying, which means like, we are the proprietors of Palestine, we are the aborigines of Palestine, stop promising Palestine for like, or giving, I can't read it from here, but the bottom line is, because of the Balfour Declaration and the promise to establish a Jewish national home for the Zionist movement, here, like the self-imagery as indigenous people. Next, please. Just in brief, about the indigeneity, there is a lot to say about it. And when we discuss it in the Palestinian context, within an international legal framework and within the Universal Declaration of the Indigenous People, UNDRIP, the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, there is a lot of Palestinian criticism to the declaration and to the international legal framing, because it assumes a post-conflict situation. It takes the state as a given, a framework. It seeks to defend and guarantee the territorial integrity of the state. It denationalizes, right, the indigenous identity, which very much doesn't apply in the Palestinian case. However, we do frame this as an anti-colonial conflict for liberation. Now, from the Israeli perspective, it's totally the opposite. Talks about the Bedouin as in newcomers. They were attacking Palestinian villages. And more so, they're saying that they have more in common with the European colonizers, because they were like raiding Palestinian villages and overtaking the land. So and ending with this, saying that it is the Jews who are like returning to their homeland 2000 later. So they are the indigenous returnees. So in a way, you make the indigenous as a colonizer, and you indigenizing the colonizer. Next one, please. Okay. This is really very important to highlight, which is the argument, you know, that the propaganda that Zionist movement, Israel is making the desert bloom, But really, it's not to negate this narrative, but really to stress that in the Palestinian case, in southern Palestine, the vast majority of the Bedouins, they subsisted on agriculture and cultivation. Okay, so it's an like, how you say, agro-pastoralist community. Within a census by the British in the 30s, 89% of the Bedouins lived primarily from cultivation and agriculture. And this is important to stress for different reasons. One is to stress the connection to the land, knowing the land rights, the land boundaries, land division. It's to stress the networks that were between the Bedouins, which are usually studied and depicted as isolated and as an exceptional social group. No, they're a group with its own particularities, but there was a lot of intercommunal, cross-border, intergeographic, Gaza, like Hebron, like Beersheba, were all networks connecting each other and connecting Palestine even to the world. We're talking about 70% of Palestine's barley was grown in southern Palestine. We're talking about exports of wheat and barley of nearly 60,000 tons exported from Gaza since the mid-19th century. And this is important really to just to contrast today's Gazan reality with the blockade and the siege and the occupation and the destruction and the making Gaza a poverty zone, where Gaza in the mid-19th century was the largest city in Palestine, the same like Jaffa and Jerusalem at the time. You had at times 40 ships arriving to the port of Gaza to load this wheat and barley to the world, to Germany and to the UK, mainly actually to the UK for the beer industry. The British saw that the Bedouin owned these lands. They're talking that every acre, if you can see in the middle, this is the Palestine survey from 1947 by the British right before the partition plan by the UN. So in the survey of Palestine, the British stressed every acre that can be economically sown is already sown in Palestine in 1947. And then out of the 577 square kilometers in the desert of Beersheba, we're talking about over 2,000 square kilometers, which means 2 million dunams that are being cultivated. And they say if the process of land registration will reach that region, all of these lands would have been registered under the Bedouin names. So even legally, within the formal legal argument, it's very clear that the Bedouin did own the land. They did cultivate the land. They're very connected to the land. They know their lands as much as they know every bit and parcel and space. And if you learn more about the names of the localities, of the mountains, of the wadis, of the villages, you will see how the space and the people of southern Palestine are very intertwined. You will see like places named after the names of the tribes, and you will have the tribes named after the names of the spaces and the geography of Palestine, of southern Palestine. It's a very like organic, connected space and people that they resemble each other, unlike foreign European legalistic colonizing arguments that happened in the last century. Just in the next slides, you will see pictures from how barley growing looked like. I think this is the last one, Victoria. I don't know if there is more. This is Beersheba city in 1900, established by the Ottomans as the capital of the region. The next one is also pictures of the mosque of Beersheba, which turned as a museum today by the Israeli government. We have a public garden here. And these are pictures from between 1900 and 1948. Next, please. Just we show a few. This is today. top left, you will see the train station, the Ottoman train station. Right below it, it's the Ottoman boys or like dormitory school in Beersheba. To the right, you'll see the mosque. The one below, I can't recognize. More, Vittoria, please. What is it? The same street in Beersheba. I mean, you'll see. There was a life, there was train station, there were networks, roads, people, lives, cultures, that all being subjected to displacement, to forced displacement, to destruction, and more. And as I said, today, only in the central West Bank, there are 45 different Bedouin villages that experience exactly the same. The famous one is Khan al-Ahmar, but we have tens others that also deemed illegal, subject to demolition, face the threat of demolitions and project, or let's say policies and practices of forced displacement. And I thank you very much for your attention. Back to you, Vittoria. And Adriana.
Thank you both. I would like to thank you first to Professor Adriana for the explanation about the Guarani communities. As the Raimundo said in the chat, it was possible to identify many similarities to Palestinian and Guarani situation. Sometimes we ask how the Israeli colonization is not denounced and exposed with the seriousness it needs. But we Brazilians also don't look at our indigenous communities. So thank you again, Professor, to the class. And thank you, Professor Ahmed, for your amazing explanation. The historical perspective since Ottoman domination illustrated the Bedouin land problem and gave us the greatest sense of the transformation of the relationship between Bedouins and the lands. In a scenario of colonization and continuous Nakba, the issue of Bedouin communities should also be discussed with all its particularities. So thank you again both. And now I would like to introduce the questions we received in the chat. So the first one was sent by Luis Henrique, and it's sent to Professor Adriana. The lands stolen from the Guarani in Aracruz, Espírito Santo, by the cellulose companies are the same lands that are today being claimed by the MST for agrarian reform. Also, to what extent have these lands never stopped being indigenous under the terms of the 1988 Constitution? I think I will ask one for Adriana and one for Ahmed, and we discuss, and I will pass to another. So the next one, the first question to Professor Ahmed was sent by Julia Lobo, and it was, what do you think is a common misconception people tend to have about the Bedouin community? So, Professor Adriana, if you like to start.
Okay, I'd like to thank you for the question and also thank Hamad for his brilliant seminar. With relation to the Aracruz lands that are being demanded by the Guarani and MST claims as well, where the Guarani are in Espírito Santo, to my knowledge, there aren't disputes with the MST. I've visited these areas many times, and they're actually in different areas. So that isn't actually there isn't a conflict between the MST and the Guarani in Aracruz, Espírito Santo. Whether these areas are indigenous, considering what the Brazilian Constitution established in 1988, is an issue that applies not only to the Guarani and Espírito Santo, but to all indigenous lands. As we know, when groups go to the judicial branch and claim that the indigenous lands should not be secured for the indigenous, what they do is try to prove that they are not they don't have these constitutional rights. But what we see is that the Guarani, as well as other indigenous people, they are constitutionally using these lands as has been foreseen by the laws. There are cases where the Guarani and other indigenous people have not been able to remain on these lands since they were displaced. They were forcefully displaced from these areas. So now in Brazil, there is a discussion that's going to be judged in the next month about the temporal mark, in which there are arguments against the indigenous people that those who were not present on the lands in 1988, when the Constitution was established, they should not have rights to these lands. But what we know is that they were there on these lands before 1988, and they were displaced from these lands. They have been forced from these lands since then, as they continue to be from ever since then. So what we see is it's a very perverse argument. It's a false argument. And I just wanted to point out that I'm very impressed by the many connections that Hamad has pointed out between the Guarani situation and the Bedouin situation, especially when he mentions the arguments that deem the Bedouin and as well as the Guarani as nomads who roam aimlessly throughout the territory with no connection or loyalty to the land, and that they ignore the profound knowledge that these populations have of every single piece of this land and the networks that tie them all together as a population, and also tie them not only within their own groups, but also to the rest of the world. And also, I'd like to point out the very interesting and sad connection about the criminalization of the Bedouin who are living on their own lands, and that this has also happened to the Guarani, not only during the military governments, but it continues to happen today. Very recently, we had Guarani leaders, including a very elderly man, who were imprisoned for being on their own lands. And very recently, in 2015, politicians formed an official commission to investigate and criminalize not only indigenous leaders, especially the Guarani, but also activists, allies, and anthropologists who work with them. So we have a very critical situation that is connected to the Palestinian situations in so many ways. So I'd like to thank you for pointing out these very interesting and heartbreaking connections. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. It was a very clarified that the situation it have some similarities. So, Professor Ahmed?
Yes. I mean, it's great how we start to see the similarities and the connections, right? Like somehow, sadly, the colonial logic, acts very similarly in many ways. We do have more, like in different, let's say, the particularities would be different from one place to another, including like the meaning of the land, the connection. But the general logic really of displacement, of replacement, of like recreating different history and arguments, and these like zones of illegality and criminality that happen. Now about the general misconceptions, I would say nomadism. Like if you say Bedouin, you would imagine like someone with a special dressing near or with a camel or on a camel and roaming, or a group. Now, it could be the case in some places, but it's not. Let's say in southern Palestine, from my research, it's not. But it's also like very important to put the concept of nomadism in its own let's say terms, right? No one roams aimlessly. Okay, even people who move, the mobility has a structure, it has a logic. Even the Ottoman land law, like for me as a legal historian, there is a category of the winter lands and there is a category of the summer lands. It's something in an economic lifestyle that was legally accommodated, accepted, very common, right? It was changed later on, legal arguments and the capitalist logic and the colonialist logic, but it's something that had a logic of mobility. It has a structure, it has special patterns that people moved in the winter for particular reasons, in the summer for particular reasons, which maybe we need to study more and learn more about. In the Palestinian case, in southern Palestine, most of the people either like settled or semi-nomadic, the Bedouins. At least in the last 100 years or more, they very much rely on agriculture, but also this integrated economy. There is pastoralism, but pastoralism did not mean that you have the entire tribe moving with the cattle from one place to another. Again, wandering. You could have one from the family or two. You could hire shepherds to do it. I found even from the Ottoman time archival resources talking about some families who left or like leased their cattle with a different tribe. Okay, so if you go to different sub-regions in southern Palestine, you will have the ratio between agriculture and pastoralism different. But there were like different mechanisms how to do it. So agriculture, I would say, nomadism, settled, and which I didn't mention, and it was in the presentation, many of the local Palestinians, they have their lands registered in land registration certificates. So this notion of they're not connected to the land, they didn't know the boundaries of their land, they didn't possess rights in the modern term, it's not correct. I mean, in our case that I researched, I have like Ottoman registration, British registration, Israeli documents in the early years. So people did like integrate within these state mechanisms and modern registration of properties. And they did continue also to run their land and landed relationships also outside these structures. So you have this combined system of documented and undocumented, in a way, land rights and landed property relationships.
Thank you, Professor, for your answer. The next one was sent by Rafael to Professor Adriana. Is there any reference to the situation of the Palestinians among indigenous people in Brazil? And the next one to Professor Ahmad was sent by Luis. Does the Palestinian Authority have a role in defending Bedouin communities? So, Professor Adriana?
Okay. I want to thank Rafael for his question. And actually, a few years ago, we had the opportunity that Arlene promoted to take some researchers from different areas, I think also from Palestine, to one of the Guarani indigenous villages in Jaraguá village in São Paulo. And the Guarani were extremely excited to receive them. And when they produced a text talking about their experiences, they were very excited to talk about their experiences in dialogue with the Palestinian situation, and hoping that the Palestinians could learn about their situations and that this could bring about a dialogue between the Palestinian communities and also the Guarani indigenous communities. So there's a space open so that these dialogues can begin. From what I've talked to the Guarani about, what I've heard from them is an extreme sensibility toward the Palestinian situation and the interest in learning more about their situation and being able to help each other and support each other through this. In concerning other indigenous groups, I can't say that I have any knowledge of this. I mean, I'm sure there is, but I don't do research among them, so I don't really know.
Thank you, Professor Ahmed.
Yes, that's the Palestinian Authority. First of all, we should know that most of like the Bedouin communities that we talked about, they live in Area C, which, according to the Oslo Agreement, this Area C is under Israeli control. Okay, this is where the Israeli settlements are, and that's actually the reason why these communities are subject to like forcible displacement. The attempt is to remove them from Area C to Area B. So you will have Area C with less Palestinians in numbers, and they occupy less Palestinian space. And they're in the area also that's strategically important from the Israeli perspective, that seeks to link Jerusalem with the massive Ma'ale Adumim settlement block all the way to the Jordan Valley. So it basically connects Jerusalem to the border with Jordan, cutting the West Bank into like different cantons. In this area where we see many of the Bedouin communities are being targeted. However, the Palestinian Authority is doing its best. We know that it doesn't have a real power and authority in many ways over what's happening in the West Bank, sadly. However, there is an attempt to bring at least this file of the Bedouin localities and villages into the ICC, right, to the International Criminal Court. It's part of the settlements file that the Palestinian Authority brought to the court. And only in terms of health and educational services, the Palestinian Authority tries to provide these communities with health and educational services. But with the most important question, which is, legalizing, preventing their eviction or the demolition of their houses, it's almost non-existent. It's unable to do it, basically.
Thank you. And I think we are in the end of our conversation, so I would like to ask the last one for each one of you. So the last question for Professor Adriana was sent by Rafael too. And Professor, just as Professor Ahmed commented, there is a bad image about Bedouins. How is the image of indigenous people who are not part of these lands in Brazil, for example, indigenous communities in big cities? Are there policies for these groups? And the last one, actually is not a question, it's more Mona Ozet, professor to University of Brasilia, asks you, Professor Ahmed, to comment the point that José Arbeck at PUC University in São Paulo points out that the military dictatorship Leadership in Brazil, as does Israel, utilized the concept of a land without people for a people without a land. So to justify the colonization. So Professor Muna asks you to comment this affirmation. So Professor Adriana?
Okay, I want to thank his question. Hello, hi. I'm using my cell phone, so sometimes I receive telephone calls. I want to thank him for his question. Concerning the image of Indigenous people who live in large cities, there are two different situations that we have to consider. First of all, you have Indigenous people living in cities on Indigenous lands. And the fact isn't that they established their lands within the cities, but actually the cities grew over their lands. And that is the case of the Guarani, for example, in São Paulo, in which they are surrounded by this extremely large city, many development projects, and they are confined to a very small area compared to what their territory would be. And actually, when their territories in São Paulo were demarcated in 1987, the government also only took into account where the houses would be. So they estimated what would be the area of non-Indigenous people if non-Indigenous people were to live in this area, and they completely disconsidered the areas that they needed for hunting, for planting, for all of their ritual activities. And so their areas were cut into very small pieces. And beginning in 2009, we reopened the demarcation of these areas in urban São Paulo, and we were able to show the areas that they use in this territory and reserve a larger portion of these areas. But this process has been suspended. And we should also note that it has been suspended in part because the state of São Paulo, the government of São Paulo, went to the justice system protesting the demarcation of these areas. So you have problems with companies, you have problems with individuals, with invaders, but you also have problems with different governments who don't want to recognize the Indigenous lands. But with relation to Indigenous people living in cities, we also have Indigenous people who aren't on lands, who are living in different kinds of communities, who are families that are scattered in different places in the cities. And there is a lot of discrimination concerning these Indigenous in urban areas. I actually did some research with teachers in the city of São Paulo, asking them what their opinions and visions, perspectives were on Indigenous people. And when they talked about Indigenous people in the Amazon, they would have all of these preconceptions, about savagery or the good primitive and wild or beautiful rituals. And when they talked about the Indigenous in major cities, the discrimination was very, very vivid. They talked about pointing out their poverty, sometimes relating them to criminal activity and so forth. The problem is that aside from the preconceptions that most Brazilians have concerning Indigenous people in the major cities, frequently there aren't public policies directed specifically for them. So, for example, the access to educational programs that recognize their cultures is something that is true for other Indigenous populations, but those who aren't on Indigenous lands don't have access to that education. Access to healthcare is precarious on Indigenous lands, as we have seen with the Yanomami, who are living true genocidal crisis, but it is also the case with the Indigenous that are out in cities. They don't have access, they have precarious access to healthcare, and the healthcare that they are provided doesn't take into consideration that they are an Indigenous population and they would have right to specific healthcare and to measures that respect their culture and don't impose our healthcare practices on these people. I think I think that's basically it. It's a struggle. Indigenous people in urban contexts live a true struggle to be recognized, to be acknowledged, not to be discriminated, and to have their fundamental constitutional rights guaranteed, more so than other indigenous populations.
Thank you very much, Professor Adriana. Now, Professor Ahmed.
Just on the last thing that Adriana said, also, we have this here also. It's very easy like to look at Bedouin as indigenous, but not to look at an urban Palestinian, let's say, in Haifa or in Ramallah as a native indigenous under colonial rule, because of all the stigma and the stereotypical image that you have to be primitive and frozen in time and unchanging throughout time to be recognized as indigenous. And sadly, we have this like language also. It exists in some of the international legal documents. But I mean, that's maybe for a different occasion to discuss. About like this, like this started with the propaganda, right? That there's like a land without a people for a people without land, which means like Palestine is a land that has no people per se. It's empty. It's a desert that is awaiting the developed people who don't have a land, European Jews who have no land to immigrate and come take the land of milk and honey and to make the desert bloom. It's propaganda. I mean, everyone, in terms of Zionist leadership, in terms of the British, everyone knew what Palestine was and who were the Palestinians and what was going on in the Holy Land, right? It was like a Zionist propaganda in some Zionist circles. But it was very clear that, I mean, when the Zionists talked early on about Palestine, about the let's say the promise of or like the commitment from the British to grant Palestine, or like to make this commitment from the British side of making Palestine a Jewish national home. It's a time when colonialism was very much accepted. It was the global order of global politics, right? Most of the world was under colonial rule. And colonialism, it was the coin that was accepted between colonial powers. So the Zionists knew very much that what they were getting is a colonial commitment and to colonize a different territory. That's why they were promised or negotiated about other areas also by the British, whether like Uganda, Argentina, or other places. But more when we had the colonial trust in the Zionist movement. We had the Palestine Colonization Association, one of the Zionist institutions to purchase land. They called them colonies. A yeshuv in Hebrew, it's more like the colonies from the Zionist side. So they did accept it. It's later on in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s when colonialism and the anti-colonial struggle emerged and colonialism became very much, a negative image in international politics, that they tried to detach now from the colonial discourse or the colonial image. But early on, that was very much accepted and as a self-image also by some of the Zionist leadership. But to get back to that, starting with Herzl, when he wrote the Alt Neo land, the Old New Land, he described Palestine as with people, right? With the immigrants, Jewish immigrants coming to Haifa, they encountered Palestinians and they became friends, and Palestinians welcomed the Jewish European immigrants because this will bring economic prosperity and they will benefit from the colonial project. The same thing later on, and from all actually the Jewish leaders, when Ben Gurion was saying there is no room for two people, etc., in Palestine. I mean, that was more like a propaganda, and at the same time, still a wishful thinking that 1948 gave the golden opportunity for the Zionist movement to switch the demographic balance in Palestine. But later on, let's say the gravity of this ideology is to allow Jewish demographic hegemony and Jewish geographic hegemony while trying to limit as much as possible Palestinian demographic growth and the Palestinian spatial dominance, right? So this is like the politics now, trying to limit as much as possible the demography and the geography in Palestine.
Thank you, Professor Ahmed. Now I would like to thank you both again for the answers, the classes, and I would like to introduce again Professor Arlene to close this presentation.
Muted, and Victoria has rushed off before I could thank her. But anyway, well, then I'll start thanking everyone. I mean, there's this whole support team in the backstage that our students and you, invited guest professors, don't see. So I'd like to thank the whole team, you know, Rafael, Alexandre, Clara, Victoria, Tabla editor, Ana Cartacho, Luis, and Laura herself. And now, coming back to what I'd rapidly like to say to close this, I'd really, really like to thank, above all, your openness, Ahmed and Adriana's openness to addressing your issues, your research side by side. I mean, we do not have any objective of comparison. We do not aim to reach any specific place. The objective was more of a process, more of being able to listen to you side by side and possibly see how Ahmed's research highlights aspects of Adriana's research and vice versa. Adriana's research highlights aspects of Ahmed's research, and it has been very, very interesting for me particularly. I mean, as Adriana said, we have visited, thanks to Adriana, because she took us there, the Guarani communities, the 5 Guarani communities here in the Pico do Jaraguá in São Paulo. It was amazing to go there. I mean, it's a whole different dimension when you can visit them, listen to them, hear what they're saying, from their cosmology, their worldview that they shortly, are proud to present to us, to their own openness to listening to where we're from and to wanting to also to get in touch. So it was an amazing experience being there. So I really thank Adriana. And the same thing with the Bedouin. I mean, I was able to twice visit and interview the Muhtar Abu Ismail of Darasheda, close to Jericho. And that was also fantastic. It was really, really amazing. So we have no objective. There's no need to compare, to say if it's similar, not similar, or this or that. But there are so many layers to everything that you have presented. I mean, there's so many windows open still to research in terms of the specificities of each of your presentations, which I know that you simply didn't have enough time to put forward. That is very interesting and gratifying for us. And finally, just to finish, I'm going to also open the space for each of you to say your final words, but I'd also like to mention that it's also very good to follow the YouTube chat, which of course I do every class, and I see what people are writing. It's very dynamic. It's very gratifying also for me as coordinator of this course to be able to see what people are saying, how involved and interested they are in what's going on here in this classroom. So thank you to everyone who's watching. I'd like to, we'll start the other way around. Ahmed, if you could give your final words, and then Adriana her final words, and we close this session. And thank you. Ahmed, please, would you like to say some final words? Anything that you have on your mind?
Actually, nothing. Just to thank you very much. I think you described really this. You summarized this really nicely. I'm very happy that this course is really running. It's a great opportunity to expand and learn more the parallels and move this to the next stage. Really, creating coalitions and partnerships of change more in addition to expanding the body of knowledge is really to bring some change to these communities in the daily realities and more. So thank you very much, Arlene, and thanks to Adriana. I learned very much personally from your talk.
Thank you, Adriana.
Well, I just want to thank you again, Arlene, for the invitation. Thank Victoria for brilliantly mediating this encounter. Thank Rafael, Editora Tabla, and especially thank Ahmad. It's been an honor to learn from you and to be able to share some of the experiences that we have had. I'm truly hopeful that we can continue this dialogue, that this will be the first of many initiatives to come. So I want to thank you for this very exciting opportunity, and here's hoping that we can continue.
Well, thank you.